But then we also have like antagonism from Cassius. Cassius is one of Darrow's allies in the beginning. But we know through the passage when he has to fight Julian, Cassius's brother, like, eek, this is going to come back to haunt us, isn't it? And you're kind of baited into thinking like, oh, maybe it'll stay hidden. But like, it's a storytelling technique. It's called Chekhov's gun. You see the gun, it's going to go off. Across galaxies and imaginative realms, stories carry us beyond the ordinary. This is Reading Things and Writing Stuff, where we explore the craft of sci-fi and fantasy stories and uncover how legendary tales are built so you can forge your own. I'm Tim Fasciola, award-winning author of the Vengeful Realm series, here to guide you through the art of storytelling. Welcome back to Reading Things and Writing Stuff. I'm Tim Fasciola, the author of A Vengeful Realm and also an author coach. Today we will be talking about the second of two essential role functions. Today is the antagonistic system. So there are different types of layers to antagonism, if you will. So where it's coming from along this axis of antagonism between protagonist down here and antagonist up here. And the antagonist should always feel, especially like I've talked about, like genre norms, genre conventions, right? So like I write epic and dark and like, so there's dark fantasy. So like when you have that scale and scope, we want the antagonistic system to be big, all atop this itty little bitty protagonist down here. And so it like the system is stacked against them, and therefore we have to rise up and overcome that. If we have a weaker antagonistic system, we kind of feel like, well, what's really at stake? Now, in cozy stories, for example, the stakes might not be that high at all, and that's okay. So it depends on genre type, and the antagonist does not always have to be a villain. Depends on the story type, but antagonist is always going to create challenges for protagonists. We talked about that the role functions of a protagonist, they need to challenge, they need to drive, and they need to have a hero moment where they answer the story question. Antagonists, they usually either are trying to create change or enforce a change or enforce stability and conserve the way it is. And that is something that the protagonist wants to change. So we're going to talk about different types of antagonists and different layers within and different character, like within the cast of characters where antagonism can come from. So your antagonist, your main antagonist, is usually the one that upholds or enforces the status quo. They are the system that your protagonist is pushing against. In Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn, The Final Empire, the Lord Ruler is very much the antagonistic force. He is king, he is God, he rules over everything. He's the one who establishes the way the houses work. He's the one who has the atium, and the atium is what is the finite resource that drives the world. So he who controls those minds, that's where the magic happens. So because ATM is what allows literally the control over time and predicting, almost predicting the very short-term future and seeing what's about to happen next, which would make you indestructible in a battle, basically. So because the Lord Ruler controls the ATM, no one can challenge the Lord Ruler. So it is about a heist of characters that are trying to steal the ATM in order to depose the Lord Ruler. So the Lord Ruler is such a strong antagonist because even though he's not on page for most of the story, his presence is felt in everything. And so you can have an antagonist be distanced, but we need to feel them. They need to have aura. They need to have a presence that impacts. So if we think about Lord of the Rings and Sauron, how much is Sauron on page? How much is he on screen in the movie? He's not. He's the eye. It's not. He's the ring. The ring is the representative of his power, and everyone underneath him, whether it's Saruman, whether it's the orcs, the Uruk-hai, the everything else is under the umbrella of what Sauron represents. So that's what I mean when I say axis of antagonism. So main antagonistic force. But then we also have diversion characters and opposition characters. So we're very familiar with antagonists. We feel like, oh, okay, yeah, they're the bad guys. And I said, not always. Sometimes they are, but usually they are. Sometimes they're not, especially in harmonious stories, which we will talk about. Real quick, I'll just give you a little overview. Harmonious story. Think like a rom-com. Think like Frozen, where Anna is Elsa's biggest problem and Elsa's Anna's biggest problem, and they are butting heads because, I want to, let it go, be free, and it's like, I just want you to love me, and like they want to, the things that they want don't allow them to come together until they come together, and they do, to overcome a late emerging secondary antagonistic system. That's a harmonious story. Disney is, famous for them, quite literally. A lot, like every romantic comedy follows that same kind of archetype, so for the most part. So those are examples where the antagonist is not necessarily a villain. I've even written one of those, and we can talk about that later. So in Mistborn, we have your antagonist being the Lord Ruler, but we also have antagonism coming from other characters, other within the houses. So Vin has to go to these balls like the Ellen Venture hosts, and well, not he himself, but like he's also there. And so Ellen is part of the antagonistic system. He is one of the Lord Rulers. He's one of the families that the Lord Ruler has in charge that kind of holds power over the Ska, the people who are most oppressed in this world. They maintain the order of the system. So there's tension and conflict that comes from her interactions with Elend. Elend is a representative of the Lord Ruler's paradigm, but the more time she spends with Elend, the more she realizes maybe he's not that close, as close to the antagonistic system as I thought he was. Obviously not in those words. And then there's other, so that would be like a diversion character. And then we have another diversion character who's another one of these magic wielding higher ups within the society, who's also a Mistborn. And Vin faces off with her. And then there's, an opposition character. And an opposition character is usually within the same side of the protagonist. So if going back to the axis of antagonism, so think everything here and down is the antagonist's allies, right? And everything here up is the protagonist's allies, antagonist's allies, right? So in the middle here, this might be let's use Lord of the Rings, right? So all the people in the Fellowship are helping Frodo, right? So whether we're talking about Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas, or we're talking about Merry and Pippin, or we're talking about Gandalf, or we're talking about Boromir. Now, in that Fellowship, Boromir fulfills the role of an opposition character. He, too, is part of the Fellowship to destroy the ring, and yet he is tempted by the ring. He thinks, well, what if we used it? What if we did this instead? What if we could save Gondor? It's coming from within the party, the protagonist's party. This type of opposition creates tension closer to home, and so it feels scary. Even though they're on the same side, there's still conflict. Having varying where your conflict is coming from is a really effective means of storytelling, because it depends on the story type. I will say that depends on genre norms and expectations, but having multiple sources of antagonism can be really beneficial. Now let's look at Red Rising. So, we have Darrow infiltrating Gold Society, right? He has to attend the Institute. He needs to survive among them, and he needs to become one of the best among them, even though these people have been training their whole lives for it, and he's been training for a few months for it. Everyone is a potential threat to him, and yet he needs to make allies for himself if he's going to survive this. Now, in Red Rising, so if we think about Nero Augustus is the system character. He's the arch governor. He's the one who enforces the status quo over Io, and therefore kind of starts Darrow's story, right? So he's the big bad. But how much time do we spend with Nero Augustus in Red Rising? Minimal. So there are diversion characters. Diversion characters are representatives of the antagonistic system. So every other gold at the Institute could fall into this. So then we have the Jackal would be a diversion character. The The Jackal is very much part of the system, so much so that he's actually the son of Arch-Governor Nero Augustus. But besides the point, because we find that out later, it doesn't matter, and if I spoiled it for you, sorry, but it's been out since 2014. Help me out here. So with a story like this, where the axis of antagonism is so layered, we have our antagonistic system, we have our representative characters in it, and Darrow doesn't really have any allies, but then he starts making allies. When you have an ally become a sense of conflict, when there's power shifts and those changes where ally becomes enemy, or like those are like gasp moments, or like, oh no. So with Darrow, the opposition character, it would be someone who's like constantly, challenging his order. And in this case, I would say that's Titus. Titus is a foil to what Darrow represents as a protagonist. Titus is also a red that's been carved by the Sons of Ares to infiltrate the Institute. He's doing the same thing Darrow's doing. And yet the way in which Titus is going about it, so vengeance driven, so vengeance focused, that will burn out and it won't survive to actually fulfill Eo's dream, right? So Titus is an opposition character. He is the Boromir in this. We're on the same side, and yet we're not. We're not trying to go about it the same way, and your way is going to lead to all of us failing the big goal. So it's often like sometimes that opposition character can come around, and sometimes they don't, and the win-loss dynamics reflect that. And that can be tied into the themes. So once again, layers, interconnectivity, congruency. But then we also have like antagonism from Cassius. Cassius is one of Darrow's allies in the beginning. But we know through the passage when he has to fight Julian, Cassius's brother, like, eek, this is going to come back to haunt us, isn't it? And you're kind of baited into thinking like, oh, maybe it'll stay hidden. But like, it's a storytelling technique. It's called Chekhov's gun. You see the gun, it's going to go off. This information will come to light and it will come back to bite us. And it does. And that's what I was talking about. Like, we have an ally who becomes an enemy. And now that's also another source of conflict. It's another diversion character. So like when the axis of antagonism is so stacked, it makes the stakes so high. We never feel safe. And therefore, we have compelling fiction. Then we can have multiple antagonists again, multiple systems at play, and they can represent something that's more symbolic. So in Song of Ice and Fire, if we look at Ned's story and we put Ned as the protagonist and Cersei as his antagonist, is she really his antagonist? Are they diametrically opposed? Not necessarily, but what does Ned represent? He represents honor. What does Cersei represent? Dishonor, pursuit of power at all costs. They're both, trying to protect their families, but it's how they go about doing it that really separates them. So in this case, while the system, there are so many systems in this, but Cersei is like the most representative of the antagonist in Darrow's story and in Ned's story. But then we can look at like individual characters and they have their own antagonists. And we can talk about that a little more in depth too. When we have stories with multiple points of view, it does become like those role functions become a little more blurry because a certain character might embody different role functions for different relationships. And it might sound like, well, gee, that's confusing. It's like, well, okay, think about yourself for a second. You are a child of someone, you have parents, but your dad also is a child of someone who has siblings and parents and children, and like you can hold more role functions and it's all relative, it's all relational. So someone who is a protagonist in their story might be someone else's antagonist in their story. And someone who is an ally in your story might be an ally in their story. It could be, the same role, like just different. It might not be. It really depends. But like understand that one character can hold multiple role functions in multiple stories within the same book. Now, this is one of my favorites. It's Nathan McCarrick's Nottingham. It's a reimagining of Robin Hood. And it is, for fans of A Song of Ice and Fire, this is historical fiction. So like the low fantasy elements, like of A Song of Ice and Fire, it's more the political nature and the use of perspective and multiple protagonists. This does that very well, but it is historical fiction. I think it appeals better to fantasy fans because it utilizes a lot of the same tropes. But man, this is one of my favorites. It has stayed with me for years now, and it's one that I always like. It's my most commonly if there's one book I can get you to read that no one else has told you to read before, it's this one. This is the one for me. What the use of perspective in one character's perspective, they are like everyone is their own hero, right? I'm the hero of my own mind. The Robin in this case versus the sheriff. The sheriff is the good guy in his story. And when you're reading his head, you see him as the good guy and you're rooting for him. But then you switch back to Robin, you're like, no, the sheriff's wrong, and you're rooting for Robin. So you can write in such a way that creates this dynamic. If we understand that different characters hold different roles in different relationships, but yet they are still the protagonists of their own story, and we treat them as such, it allows the reader to have differing views of perspective. This is why reading has the capacity to create empathy, and why reading is so important and why media literacy is so important. Books like this remind us of that. It's so profound, so powerful when done well. So antagonists are so paramount to the success of a story. And I mentioned the weaknesses in when I'm reading or editing for someone and going through and just kind of giving them a story analysis, and I see kind of weak representation or weakly embodied antagonistic systems, and this doesn't provide the protagonist anything to push against, and it's so common to keep your characters safe. And that works for certain genres. Cozy, low stakes, you know what I mean? But I only work with sci-fi fantasy, right? So, and I trend to more of the epic and more of if you're trying to keep your characters safe, that's not it. That's not it's not where the magic happens. Conflict needs to come from somewhere, and you can vary where it's coming from, but it needs to come from somewhere, whether it's within your own party, from your own allies, from people who maybe are not diametrically opposed, but your goal and their goal conflict with one another, or it's coming from the top where it's you diametrically have different viewpoints and we want the same thing, and if I have it, you can't have it, and if you have it, I can't have it, and I'm going to have it, and that creates the conflict. But we need that source of conflict. Now, my stories, again, being epic or dark, I have a lot of systems. So in A Vengeful Realm, for example, so if we follow Zephyrus's story, so Zephyrus is up against the big side, the kingdom that upholds the slavery that he is now brought into. That's one system. But then he's recruited by that same kingdom, by Prince Ladin, and said, I will give you your freedom, which is what he wants, if you help me uproot the revivalists. And the revivalists are a group of zealots that are plotting anarchy specifically to kill Ladin's father, the king. He's like, I will give you your freedom if you stop these guys. So that's another system. He's working with the antagonistic system to depose and get rid of a secondary antagonistic system, so that his goal would be to, go against that primary antagonistic system. So it's layered. Now, even within that, there's I mentioned this in earlier episodes, but Zephyrus has a prophecy, and Zephyrus's prophecy is interpreted one way by one group of people, another way by another group of people, and another way by a third group of people. And some people think okay, he needs to because he's been chosen, he needs to fulfill his prophecy. And remember, Zephyrus doesn't have his memory, so he's not really sure who to believe and who's right, who's wrong, and he only has his principles to kind of guide him and be his to drive him or be his guide. But then there's other subsystems, I'm talking. So now he's positioned within the gladiatorial ludus, or other gladiators are trained to compete and fight. So there's his Ladin owns him, but gifts him so that he can fulfill his role to uproot the revivalists, specifically in this house. So now he's under this new domina, this new dominus, this master, right? And they represent another system. And then once he's within the barracks of the ludus, the other gladiators and their different belief systems, those are other systems, other sources of conflict. So Zephyrus has so many different antagonists in different systems. Now, which one holds the primacy? It's most of the story is him versus the revivalists. And that is, the revivalists are represented by one character. That one character in this case would be Lennox. So like when we have, it's him versus Lennox, but there's still him versus that and him versus that and him versus that. And then that's what the whole trilogy is kind of based off of. Like, it's a nesting dolls of conflict that are kind of backed by another thing and backed by another thing and backed by another thing. So Lennox is part of the revivalists, but the revivalists are part of, the kingdom, but the kingdom is run by the gods. So like, if you really want to get, to the source of the conflict, the source of the, root of all evil, so to speak, it has to go to the gods. And that's what like I often, pitch A Vengeful Realm as like Spartacus's rebellion from Rome meets Kratos' war against the gods of Olympus. And that's where that comes from. It's not just like, I want my freedom. It's like, well, I want my freedom. I want my people to have their freedom. But if they're going to have their freedom, all of us need our freedom from these oppressive gods. And mix all that in with the political intrigue of Game of Thrones, and you have A Vengeful Realm. Now, let's look at it a little differently. I mentioned that, like, a harmonious story that I'd written. So this is Ghosts of Rania. This is actually the prequel to, it kind of stands alone, but like if you've read this and then you read this, you'd be like, I see where we got here. If you read this and then like without the context of that, you certainly can, and then you can jump right in. You can read this and not that. You can read that and not this. Doesn't matter. It was written in such a way that you would have different Easter eggs regardless of the order you read, as long as you read those three in order. You need to read those in order. But in Ghosts of Rania, there's two estranged sisters that live on a cursed island. And this cursed island is ruled over by a blood magic wielding skeleton king. Now, one sister wants to lead a revolt against the skeleton king. The other sister wants to gather as many people as she can to lead this mass exodus away from the skeleton king and the curse that he imposes over this land. But the sister that wants to lead the rebellion needs the people to fight, not flee. And the other sister who's trying to lead the exodus, she doesn't want people dying in a war that she believes can't be won. So these two sisters are the primary antagonistic forces against one another. One is trying to, round up the people trying to flee and make them fight. And the other sister is trying to escape the other sister, trying to round them up and make them fight in a war that they don't believe in. And all this while the skeleton king is still there, but kind of distant. And that secondary system needs to be felt rather than present. So when they do emerge, it's not like, well, they came out of nowhere. Like they need to still be there, like lurking, lingering, whether they're empowered and gathering power, whether they are geographically far away, but there needs to be some semblance of distance to allow the focal point to kind of be the tension between the sisters. So this is an example of the antagonist is not a villain. If you are in one sister's head, Thraina, you're like, yeah, I agree with Thraina. If you're in the other sister's head, Layla, you're like, no, totally see Layla's point. And that's where it becomes difficult. And I always say, like, when, talking about this book, like, it's not right versus wrong. It's just hard. Not good and bad, not good and evil. No. It's just hard sometimes. Now, don't get me wrong. Skeleton King, not a good guy. So, like, there is this big bad, if you will. There is a villain, but it's late emerging. It's not the crux of the story. It's more in the background or late emerging, coming in later. And so that's a different type of story. Now, the other one I've mentioned before, Boon Blessed. So that's my other story. It's not out yet. It will be coming soon. But this is a story where the role functions of the antagonist are kind of hidden because it's kind of told more as a mystery where, she's kind of recruited to she's trying to find who murdered her husband. Arcadia is the name of the protagonist. So Arcadia is brought into this group that believes that there is an internal power grasp that's happening. And there's fear of an external component from their main, our country's at war with their country. But I think there is someone within that is weakening us to war coming from without. And so she has a personal goal within the societal goal within the world conflict. And when you have that type of layering, there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of conflict. There's conflict. So she has to compete in these trials in order to find out, she wants to find who murdered her husband. But for these people, she's trying to find who's manipulating the trials. And within who's manipulating the trials, is it coming from, one of the other political factions within this country? Or is it coming from without? Or is there a combination of both? And so the main source of antagonism is actually hidden. And that's the whole mystery, trying to find where is this coming from. So you have to understand the role function that, I don't have an antagonist on page for 95% of the book. So how can there still be conflict? There needs to be that presence. There needs to be that aura. There needs to be other sub-conflicts that are under the umbrella of that main antagonist. And all of those things, lead to the other, and then the breadcrumbs come together and we have a whole loaf, and now it finally makes sense. So you can hide the role functions, especially in stories where there's more of a mysterious component. And that very much is the case in that story type. So if you understand these role functions, you can utilize them, you can weaponize them for your storytelling. And it makes for you need, once again, essential role functions, protagonist, antagonistic system. If you nail these, you're set up for success. You're in really good shape because once again, readers can imprint on characters very quickly. You can establish trust very early on. Getting them to fall in love with a world or a magic system takes a little bit more time, but if you get your characters right, you can create readers for life. All right. So thank you so much for listening to this chapter of Reading Things and Writing Stuff. I hope you will tell me about your antagonists that you're writing, some of your favorite villains that you've read. Hit me up in the comments. Let me know what you're reading now. And I appreciate you. I hope you'll join me as we turn the page and enter into the next episode.